I wasn't supposed to find out like that, not standing on my own front porch with a suitcase in one hand and a stranger's car in the driveway like I had the wrong address, not hearing my mother's voice through the door before she even opened it, low and careful like she was explaining something that shouldn't need explaining. Just keep it simple when she asks, she said, and then the door opened and everything went quiet for half a second too long. My father stood in the hallway, not surprised, not relieved, just paused like I had interrupted a conversation that mattered more than my arrival, and I smiled because I always do. "Hi, Dad," I said, and he nodded once like I had come back from the grocery store, not 10 years overseas, not a decade of wire transfers and missed holidays and birthdays. I watched his eyes move to the suitcase, then back to my face, calculating something I couldn't see yet. "You didn't tell us you were coming today," he said, and his tone was polite, the kind you use with guests, and I felt that land somewhere deeper than I expected. "I thought I'd surprise you," I said softly, and stepped inside the house I paid for, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. Not wrong, just different, like someone else's routine had settled into the walls. I set my suitcase down by the stairs, and my mother appeared from the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her smile came a second late. "Tige," she said, like she was trying the name on to see if it still fit, and she hugged me lightly, not the way you hold someone you've missed, just enough to say you did it. I pulled back and looked around. Small changes at first: a new couch, a different set of frames on the wall, none of them mine, none of them from the boxes I shipped home over the years. "You've redecorated," I said, and she glanced at my father before answering. "We had to make a few adjustments," she said, and there it was, that word had to, like something had been decided without me, and I nodded because that's what I do. "I observe, I file things away, I don't rush to conclusions." "Of course," I said, "as long as you're comfortable." I walked toward the living room, and that's when I saw it, a stack of mail on the coffee table, not mine, not addressed to me, a different last name, clean and centered like it belonged there. I picked up the top envelope and read it once, then again, just to be sure the address was correct, the house number, the street, everything matched except the name. I turned it slightly so the light hit the print, and I could feel my father watching me now, my mother too, both of them waiting for something. "Is this new?" I asked, gently holding the envelope between two fingers like it might explain itself. My father cleared his throat. "We've been helping someone out," he said quickly, and I nodded again because that sounded familiar. "Family helps family, I've heard that my whole life." I set the envelope back down exactly where I found it and smoothed the edge like I didn't want to disturb the scene. "That's kind of you," I said, and I meant it. Kindness has always sounded good in this house, even when it cost me everything. I took a slow breath and let my eyes move across the room, the corners, the door frames, the small details people forget to change, and then I saw it, the document on the side table, half tucked under a magazine, a clean white page with a header bold enough to catch attention without asking for it. I stepped closer, not too fast, not suspicious, just curious, and I read the first line and then the second, and something inside me went very still. My name wasn't there. It should have been. It always had been for 10 years. Every transfer, every receipt, every confirmation carried my name like a signature on this life, and now it was gone, replaced cleanly, legally, intentionally. I could hear my mother behind me shifting her weight. I could hear my father inhale like he was about to speak, and I turned back to them with the same small smile I practiced for years, the one that makes people underestimate what I understand. "When did this change?" I asked quietly, and neither of them answered right away, and in that silence I realized something that made everything else make sense. I hadn't come home to my house, I had walked into someone else's decision, and the question wasn't what they had done, the question was why they thought I would never notice. I have always been good with numbers, not the kind you show off at dinner tables, but the kind that sit quietly in the background, adding up over time, interest that compounds, decisions that echo years later. My name is Tige Monroe, and I learned early that money is rarely just money, it is intention, it is trust, it is proof of who shows up and who does not. I left home at 23 with one suitcase, a one-way ticket, and a promise I made to myself that if I was going to build something I would build it properly, not fast, not loud, just correctly. My father said it was the right decision. He said there was not much for me here anyway. My mother hugged me at the airport and told me to call when I landed, and I did, and then I called again the next week and the week after that until the calls became shorter and the questions simpler. "Are you doing okay?" became, "Did you send it yet?" I did not take it personally at first distance. Does that? It changes what people ask about. It simplifies relationships into checklists and transactions. I worked long hours, the kind that blur mornings into nights. I took extra shifts. I said yes when other people said no. I learned the systems. I watched how money moved, how it disappeared, how it multiplied when handled correctly, and I kept my expenses low. Small apartment, shared kitchen, second-hand furniture. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it had a purpose every month. On the first I made a transfer the same amount at the beginning, then more as my income grew. I never missed one, not once, even when I was sick, even when I was exhausted, even when I had to choose between replacing something I needed and keeping the number consistent. I kept the number consistent because that was the agreement, not written, not formal, but understood. My parents would take care of things at home, the house, the repairs, the future, and I would provide the means. My father would call sometimes after the transfer, cleared his voice, steady, appreciative, in a practical way. "That will help a lot," he would say, or "we are making progress," and I would picture it, the house improving slowly, room by room, small upgrades, better floors, stronger roof, things that last. My mother would add details, softer ones. "The kitchen looks brighter now," or "your father finally fixed the back steps," and I held on to those images. They became my version of home, something stable, something waiting. I sent more when they mentioned unexpected costs, a pipe, a leak, a bill that came earlier than planned. I did not ask for receipts, I did not ask for breakdowns. Trust does not ask those questions, at least not at the beginning. Years passed like that, quietly, efficiently. My life abroad became structured, predictable. Work, transfer, sleep, repeat. Holidays were just different days on the calendar. I sent gifts instead of showing up. I watched celebrations through pictures, my sister standing in rooms I helped fund, smiling in front of walls I had never seen in person, my parents at the table I imagined for them, always comfortable, always taken care of. Because that was the point. I was not there, but my effort was. I remember one winter in particular, the heating system at home needed to be replaced. It was more than usual, a significant amount. My father hesitated when he told me, "We can manage it slowly," he said, and I remember smiling, even though he could not see it. "No need to do things slowly when they can be done properly," I said, and I transferred the full amount. That night I stayed up late watching the confirmation screen longer than necessary. Something about that number felt important, like a milestone, like proof that everything was working the way it should. Over time the numbers grew larger, the transfers more substantial, promotions came, responsibilities increased. I handled accounts bigger than anything my family had ever seen, and still every month on the first I made the same decision. Before anything else I took care of home. That word became abstract, a location I supported more than a place I experienced, but I believed in it. I believed in what we were building together, even if I was the only one physically absent. I told myself that absence did not matter because consistency does, because showing up in the same way over and over again creates something reliable, something that cannot be easily undone. And for 10 years that belief held steady, until the moment I stood in that living room holding an envelope with someone else's name on it, and realized that while I had been building something carefully, patiently, intentionally, I had never once stopped to ask who was actually holding it. I did not confront them that first hour or even that first day. I carried the realization quietly, the way you carry something fragile, not because it might break, but because you need time to understand its weight. I stayed in the house that night, in a room that used to be mine and felt like a guest room now. The bed was different, the closet half empty, the small things that make a space yours had been replaced or removed without ceremony. I sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at my hands for a long time, trying to match the feeling in my chest with something I could name. Disappointment would have been easier, anger would have been cleaner. But this was something quieter, something that spread slowly, like a truth that had been waiting for me to arrive before it revealed itself. I thought about every transfer, every late night, every decision I had made to prioritize them over myself. And for a moment I allowed a question I had avoided for years to surface. What if none of it meant what I thought it meant? What if the structure I believed we were building together had never existed in the form I imagined? I did not cry, I did not call anyone. I simply sat there and let the silence answer me. The next morning I woke up early, out of habit, not rest. The house was already active, voices in the kitchen low, controlled. I walked in and my mother handed me a cup of coffee with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You should rest, you just got in," she said, and I thanked her because politeness has always been my language, even when clarity is not offered. I sat at the table across from my father and placed my hands around the cup, letting the warmth ground me. "I came across a document yesterday," I said gently, and both of them stilled, just slightly, not enough for someone unfamiliar to notice, but enough for me. "It had a different name on it," I continued, and my father exhaled slowly, like someone preparing to explain something complicated. "We were going to talk to you about that," he said, and I nodded once, giving him space to continue because I wanted to hear it in his words, not mine. "The situation changed over the years," he began, choosing each word carefully. "We had to make decisions that made sense for the family as a whole." I listened without interrupting because interruption would only shorten the explanation, and I needed it complete. "Your sister needed stability," he said finally, and there it was, a direction, a shift in focus that placed everything in a different light. "She has been living here for a while now," my mother added softly. It made more sense to put things in her name for certain arrangements. I felt something settle inside me, not a break, not a collapse, just a quiet alignment between what I had suspected and what was now being confirmed. Arrangements, I repeated calmly. What kind of arrangements require removing my name entirely? My father's expression tightened slightly, not defensive, just firm. Legal ones, he said. It is cleaner this way, and you have done well for yourself. You do not need this property the way she does. I let that sentence sit between us because it carried more than its words. It carried the assumption that what I had built could be reassigned without consequence, that my contribution was transferable, that my absence had converted my ownership into something optional. I placed the cup down, carefully aligning it with the edge of the table before speaking again. So the house I funded is no longer mine, I said, not as a question but as a confirmation. My mother reached for my hand but stopped just short of touching it. It is still family, she said gently, that has not changed. And for the first time I felt the full weight of what had happened, not just the transfer of a name on a document but the redefinition of my role from owner to provider, from participant to resource. I stood up slowly, not abruptly, just enough to create space between us. Thank you for explaining, I said with the same calm tone I have always used, because respect does not disappear just because clarity arrives. But inside something had shifted completely. The structure I believed in was gone, replaced by something more precise, more visible, more real. And as I walked out of the kitchen, I understood that the betrayal was not in the decision itself. It was in the certainty that I would accept it without question. I did not argue after that conversation. I did not raise my voice or demand explanations beyond what had already been offered, because something inside me had gone quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar, not peaceful, not resolved, just distant, like I was observing my own life from a step away. I walked out of the house that afternoon without saying where I was going, and no one asked. The air outside felt different, lighter, but not in a comforting way, more like I had stepped out of something heavy I had not realized I was carrying for years. I drove without a destination at first, just letting the roads I used to know guide me past places that still looked the same, but no longer felt connected to me. The coffee shop on the corner, the park where I used to sit with my mother on Sundays, the grocery store my father insisted on because he trusted their prices. Everything remained unchanged except the meaning I had attached to it, and that realization settled slowly, deeply. I pulled over near the edge of town where the view opens up just enough to remind you how small everything is from a distance, and I sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, thinking about 10 years not as a timeline, but as a series of choices I had made deliberately, consistently, without hesitation. I thought about the first transfer I ever sent. The amount was modest, but the intention behind it was absolute. I remember watching the confirmation screen and feeling a sense of purpose, like I had just taken the first step toward building something real, something lasting, something that would eventually welcome me back. And now, sitting there, I allowed myself to ask a question I had avoided with precision for a decade. What if I had been building something that was never mine? To return to the thought did not arrive with anger, it arrived with clarity, clean and undeniable. I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of that realization settle fully into place. I was not just excluded from a decision, I had been redefined within it. My role had shifted quietly over time, from daughter to provider, from participant to solution, and I had accepted that shift without question because it had felt like responsibility, like care, like love. But stripped of those interpretations, it looked different. It looked like a system that functioned without needing my presence, only my contribution. I opened my eyes and looked at my phone resting in the cup holder, a simple object that had carried every transaction, every confirmation, every piece of evidence of what I had given. And for a moment I considered doing nothing. I considered returning to my apartment abroad, continuing the pattern, sending money on the first of the month, maintaining the structure that had defined my life for so long. It would have been easy, familiar, even expected. I could have told myself that this was still family, that support does not require ownership, that what matters is that they are taken care of. I could have rewritten the meaning of everything to make it easier to continue, but as I sat there I realized something that made that option impossible. The version of me who would accept that no longer existed. She had been built on an understanding that was no longer true, and continuing would not be loyalty, it would be avoidance. I let out a slow breath and looked out at the horizon. Again, the stillness in that moment was not empty, it was transitional, like the pause between one decision and the next. I was not angry, I was not even visibly hurt. I was simply aware of what had happened, aware of what it meant, and aware that for the first time in 10 years I was standing in a position where I could choose something different, and that choice would not be driven by obligation or expectation, it would be driven by clarity, and clarity has a way of making certain paths impossible to walk again, even when they once felt like the only ones available. I did not go back to the house that evening, not because I was avoiding them, but because I needed distance to Think without their version of the story filling the room. I checked into a small hotel near the highway, nothing special, just clean, quiet, predictable, the kind of place where no one asks questions, and no one expects explanations. I placed my suitcase by the window, set my phone on the desk and sat down like I was about to begin something important. Because I was, for the first time in 10 years, I was not reacting, I was deciding. I opened my laptop and pulled up my records, not just the recent ones, all of them, every transfer, every confirmation, every note I had ever made. I had kept everything, not out of suspicion, but out of habit, because that is how I work. I do not rely on memory when data exists. I let the numbers speak first. I built a timeline methodically, month by month, year by year, amounts increasing, patterns forming, consistency that could not be dismissed or minimized. It was all there, clean, structured, undeniable. I cross-referenced dates with the limited updates I had received from home, and the gaps became clearer, not just emotional gaps but factual ones, periods where significant amounts had been sent with no corresponding explanation, no visible result, no logical allocation. I did not rush to conclusions. I documented, I organized, I labeled, because clarity requires structure. And I was no longer interested in assumptions, I was interested in proof. I then moved to the property records, publicly accessible, quietly revealing. I searched the address, and there it was, the current ownership listed in a name that was not mine. The transfer date aligned precisely with a period when my contributions had been at their highest, when I had been working the most, sending the most, trusting the most. I read the document twice, not because I did not understand it, but because I wanted to confirm that the simplicity of it matched the complexity of what it represented. My name had never been formally attached, not once, not in any official capacity. Everything I had built had been funded through accounts I controlled but directed toward a structure I never legally secured, and that realization was not emotional, it was technical. It was the difference between belief and ownership, and I had confused the two. For a decade I leaned back in the chair and allowed myself a small moment of stillness, not to process the betrayal that had already settled but to consider the position I was now in, because positions matter more than feelings in situations like this, and my position was not as weak as they believed. I opened my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not needed to call in years. Daniel Brooks, a colleague from early in my career, now a partner at a firm that specialized in financial compliance and asset tracing, someone who understood systems not just in theory but in practice. I pressed call, and when he answered his voice carried the same steady clarity. I remembered. Tige, it has been a while, he said, and I allowed a small smile. It has, I replied. I need your perspective on something. I did not explain everything at once, I never do. I provided the structure, the key facts, the timeline, the transfers, the property change, and then I stopped, because the right people do not need a full story, they need accurate data. There was a brief pause on the line, not hesitation, just processing. Do you have records? He asked, and I looked at the screen in front of me. Every single one, I said, and he exhaled slowly, not surprised, just acknowledging the shift. Then you are not in the position they think you are, he said, and that sentence settled into place like a final piece of a pattern I had already begun to see. There are multiple angles here, he continued. Financial misrepresentation, potential misuse of transferred funds, and depending on how things were structured there may be legal grounds for recovery or leverage. I listened carefully, not interrupting, because this was not about reaction, this was about direction. I am not interested in conflict for the sake of it, I said calmly. I am interested in accuracy, and he understood immediately. Then we build it properly, he replied, and that word properly carried weight for me. It always has. I closed my laptop slowly after the call, not because I was finished but because I had what I needed, a path, not emotional, not impulsive but precise. I was no longer standing in confusion or even in hurt, I was standing in information, and information, when structured correctly, becomes control. And as I looked out the window at the quiet stretch of highway, I realized something simple and final. They had made their decision years ago, quietly, confidently, assuming I would never question it, and now I was about to make mine, just as quietly, just as confidently, but with one difference. I had the full picture. The next morning I returned to the house at exactly 9:15, because timing matters when people have built their confidence around the assumption that you will arrive emotional instead of prepared. I walked in through the front door with the same calm expression I had worn the day before and found my mother in the kitchen arranging flowers like normalcy could be assembled if the details were pretty enough. My father was at the table reading something that looked important until he saw me and put it down. You were out late, he said, and his tone carried the quiet authority he had used my entire life, the kind meant to close a subject before it opens. I set my bag on the chair and smiled lightly. I had a few things to review. I said. My mother glanced between us and asked if I wanted coffee, and I thanked her yes, because courtesy is useful. It slows people down, it makes them underestimate what is coming. My sister arrived a few minutes later from upstairs, still in house clothes, still comfortable, still moving through rooms funded by a decade of my restraint. Like comfort had always belonged to her. She stopped when she saw me, and for half a second something uncertain crossed her face before she corrected it into brightness. You are up early, she said, and I nodded. I wanted us all together, I replied. That got my father's attention immediately. Not fear, not yet, just alertness, the kind people have when a conversation is no longer staying in the shape they expected. I waited until everyone had sat down before I opened my bag and placed a folder neatly in the center of the table, not slammed, not dramatically, just placed with care, because evidence does not need theatrics. I spent last night organizing records, I said, and my mother's hand paused around her mug. My father said nothing. My sister leaned back slightly, like distance itself might become protection. 10 years of transfers, I continued, dates, amounts, confirmations, and a timeline of every stated reason I was given for sending additional funds. I slid the first page toward my father, and he did not touch it at first. He only looked at it like touching it would make it more real. Tige, there is no need to make this bigger than it is, he said, and I met his eyes with the same calm tone I had used since childhood. Respectfully, Dad, this became bigger than it should have. The moment decisions were made with my money and without my knowledge. My sister let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. It is still family, she said. No one stole from you. And there it was, the sentence designed to simplify the entire structure into something emotional instead of factual. I turned to her politely. That depends on what one considers theft, I said. If someone contributes the full cost of a property under the understanding that it remains part of the future they are funding, and that property is then transferred into another person's control without disclosure, the language may vary, but the intention does not. The room went very still. My mother spoke next, softly, carefully. We were trying to protect stability, and I nodded once. For whom, I asked, and no one answered, because the answer was visible in the room itself, in the stairs my sister had just walked down, in the kitchen my mother had rearranged, in the seat my father occupied so comfortably. While explaining why I no longer needed what I had paid for, I opened the second folder and laid out copies of the property records. The transfer date highlighted, the ownership change clear, impossible to soften. This is the legal transfer, I said, and this is the period during which I was sending the highest monthly amounts on the understanding that the house remained part of our shared plan. My father finally reached for the paper, but his hand moved more slowly. Now you are making this sound malicious, he said, and for the first time I let a harder truth enter my voice, not louder, just cleaner. No, Dad, I am making it sound documented. My sister stood up, then too quickly, too defensively. What exactly do you want, she asked, and I folded my hands in front of me because I had asked myself that question already and answered it before entering the house. Accuracy, I said. First, full acknowledgement of what was done, and how. Second, immediate suspension of any further financial expectation from me, and third, a formal response through counsel regarding recovery options and beneficial interest claims. My mother blinked at the word counsel. My father's face changed, not dramatically, just enough, a small withdrawal of certainty, and my sister looked from one parent to the other, as if one of them should fix this the way they always had. Counsel, my father repeated, and I nodded. Yes, I said, and right then there was a knock at the door, not loud, not theatrical, just punctual. My mother turned toward the sound. My father did not move. I stood and walked to the entryway myself, because I knew exactly who it was. Daniel stepped inside in a dark suit, carrying a leather portfolio, and the room shifted before he spoke, because some people bring order in with them, and order frightens those who have relied on vagueness. Good morning, Ms. Monroe, he said, and then he looked past me into the kitchen with professional calm. I am here regarding the financial records and property transfer review. No one said anything for a moment. My father stared at me as if he was seeing not his daughter, not the version of me that sent money quietly from far away, but the woman who had come back with dates, documents, and a witness. My sister sat down slowly. My mother lowered herself into her chair, and Daniel opened his portfolio on the table with quiet precision. We can do this privately and respectfully, he said, but we will do it clearly. And that was the moment the house changed for the second time, not when they took my name off it, not when they put hers on it, but when they realized I had walked back in with mine fully intact. No one spoke for a long time after Daniel placed the documents on the table, not because there was nothing to say, but because for the first time everything had to be said correctly, not casually, not with soft language or familiar phrases, but with precision. My father was the first to sit back fully in his chair, not leaning forward, not in control, just still as if recalculating something he had been certain of for years. My mother kept her hands folded in her lap, her eyes moving between the pages and my face like she was searching for a version of me that would make this easier. My sister did not speak at all. She watched the documents the way people watch something that cannot be undone, and Daniel did not rush. He never does. He let the silence settle, because silence has a way of forcing truth to the surface without pressure. We can proceed in one of two ways, he said calmly. We can formalize a review of all transferred funds and establish beneficial ownership claims, which would involve a detailed audit and potential legal recovery, or we can discuss an immediate acknowledgement and structured resolution that reflects the financial reality already documented. My father finally exhaled, not sharply, just enough to break the stillness. This is unnecessary, he said, but the certainty that had been in his voice the day before was gone, replaced by something quieter, something that understood. It was no longer defining the terms. Nothing about this is unnecessary, I replied gently, not challenging him, just correcting the premise. This is simply accurate. My mother looked at me, then truly looked at me in a way she had not the day before, not as the daughter who left, not as the one who sent money, but as someone she did not fully recognize. You would take this that far? She asked softly, and I held her gaze with the same calm respect I had always shown her. I would take it exactly as far as the truth requires, I said, and that was the moment something shifted completely, not in the room, not in them, but in me, because for the first time I was not adjusting my position to maintain comfort. I was maintaining clarity, even if it disrupted everything else. My sister finally spoke, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. So what happens now? She asked, and I turned to her without hesitation, because she deserved a clear answer, even if it was not the one she expected. Now we define what actually belongs to whom, I said, not emotionally, not historically, but factually. Daniel slid a single page forward toward them, not aggressive, not demanding, just present. This outlines a preliminary option, he said. Recognition of financial contribution, establishment of proportional interest, and a structured agreement that prevents further misrepresentation. My father looked at the page but did not pick it up this time. His hands remained still on the table, like he understood that touching it meant accepting something larger than the paper itself. My mother reached for it instead, slowly, carefully, and read each line with the kind of attention that comes when there is no longer space for interpretation. And as she read, I stood there quietly, not waiting, not hoping, simply present, because the outcome no longer depended on convincing them. It depended on whether they were willing to align with what was already evident. We never meant to exclude you, she said finally, her voice softer than before, and I nodded, because I believed that intention, and still recognized its impact. Intent does not change structure, I replied, and structure is what defines reality. The words did not land harshly, they landed clearly, and clarity has its own weight. My father closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, and for the first time there was no attempt to redirect, no attempt to simplify, no attempt to reduce this to something manageable. We will review it, he said, and it was not a refusal, it was not an agreement, it was something in between, something honest enough to acknowledge that the situation had moved beyond his control, and I accepted that, because resolution is not always immediate. Sometimes it begins with recognition. Daniel gathered his documents with the same measured precision he had entered with, and gave a small nod indicating that the next steps would proceed as outlined, and as he stepped back toward the door I remained where I was, not to hold the moment but to understand it fully, because this was the point where everything I had believed about loyalty, about family, about contribution had been tested against something real and measurable, and I had chosen not to abandon those values but to apply them differently, to include myself within them as someone who deserved the same consideration, the same respect, the same clarity I had given so freely for so long. And as I walked out of the house once more, not with uncertainty, not with hesitation, but with a quiet sense of completion, I realized that the most important thing I had recovered was not the property, not the money, not even the acknowledgement. It was the simple, undeniable understanding that I no longer needed to be invited into my own life. I could define it myself, and that was something no one in that house could ever take from me again. The process did not take as long as they expected it to, not because it was rushed, but because everything had already been done years earlier. Every transfer, every record, every confirmation had quietly built a structure that could now be seen clearly once someone chose to look at it properly. Within 2 weeks, formal communication began, not emotional, not personal, but precise. Letters drafted, reviewed, and delivered, outlining financial contribution timelines, discrepancies Between stated use and actual allocation and the legal implications of redirecting assets funded by a single source without disclosure, my father responded first through counsel, not directly, his language careful, measured, no longer simplified into family phrases but adjusted to meet the tone that had been set. My mother called once during that time, her voice softer than I had ever heard it, asking if there was another way to resolve things without making it official, and I listened respectfully. Before answering with the same clarity I had carried from the beginning, "This is already official, it just was not acknowledged before." I did not raise my voice, I did not explain further, because at this point explanation was no longer necessary. Everything had been documented, everything had been presented, the only thing left was alignment or resistance. My sister did not call at all, she sent one message, short, uncertain. I did not know it was like that, and I believed her not as an excuse but as context, because systems like this do not require everyone to understand them, they only require enough people to benefit from them without asking questions. The resolution came in stages, not dramatic, not loud, but decisive. First, a formal acknowledgement of financial contribution signed and verified, establishing proportional ownership that could not be dismissed or reinterpreted. Then a negotiated agreement restructuring the property interest, placing legal control back into alignment with the actual source of funding. It was not a reversal in the emotional sense, it was a correction in the factual one. The house did not change. Physically the walls remained the same, the rooms held the same furniture, but its meaning shifted completely. It was no longer a place defined by assumptions, it was defined by record, by agreement, by clarity. My father signed the final documents without commentary, not defeated, not angry, just quiet, in a way I had never seen before, as if he had finally encountered something he could not manage through tone or timing. My mother signed next, her hand steady but slower, her eyes lingering on each line, not because she did not understand but because she did. My sister signed last, after a long pause, not looking at me, not looking at them, just at the page in front of her, as if reading something that had always been there but had never been fully seen before. There were consequences, not the kind people expect, not public, not explosive, but real. Responsibilities shifted, expectations disappeared, the monthly transfers stopped immediately, not as a statement but as a natural result of the new structure. I was no longer a resource to be managed, I was a participant with defined boundaries and recognized position, and that changed everything in ways that did not require discussion. Months later I returned to the house again, not to reclaim it, not to prove anything, just to see it as it now existed within a structure that made sense. I walked through each room slowly, not with nostalgia, not with resentment, just observation, the same way I had always approached things, and for the first time there was no distortion, no gap between what I had given and what I could see. The alignment was complete. My father met me in the living room, his posture different, not less confident, just more aware. "You handled this well," he said, and I nodded slightly. "I handled it accurately," I replied, and that was enough. My mother asked if I wanted tea and I said yes, because some habits do not need to change to be meaningful. My sister stayed mostly quiet, but when I was leaving she walked with me to the door and said softly, "I should have asked more questions," and I looked at her, not with judgment but with understanding. "Most people do not until they have to," I said, and she nodded as if that answer explained more than anything else could. I stepped outside with nothing to take back, nothing to prove, nothing to reclaim, because everything that mattered had already been restored, not just the property, not just the money, but something far more important, the clarity of my own position, the recognition of my own value, the understanding that contribution without definition invites confusion, and that clarity once established does not need to be defended, it simply needs to be maintained. And as I walked away I realized the outcome had never been about winning against them, it had been about no longer losing myself in a system that depended on my silence to function.